The 1920s was a decade riddled with political scandals. Most of these scandals originated from the Harding administration from 1920 to 1923. Warren G. Harding and his vice president Calvin Coolidge won the election of 1920 in a landslide victory. Harding's cabinet mainly consisted of his friends and political allies. They were known as the Ohio Gang. In 1921, the infamous Teapot Dome scandal began when the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, a member of the so-called Ohio Gang, was able to gain control over valuable oil fields in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hill, California. These oil fields had been set aside by the government for use by the Navy. In 1922, Secretary Fall made a secret deal with two rich oilmen. He gave them a lease to pump oil out of the fields and sell it for themselves. Fall received $325,000 and a large herd of cattle. After over 6 years of testimony and implicating others in the Harding administration, Secretary Fall received a $100,000 fine and was sentenced to a year in jail. There were also many other scandals that happened within the Ohio Gang. Jesse Smith, assistant to the Attorney General, was exposed as a bagman. He was carrying bribes to and from the Attorney General's office. He was banished from Washington, and he later committed suicide. Yet another scandal within the Harding administration involved Charles Kramer, a legal advisor to the Veterans Bureau, who was exposed for taking bribes, and he too committed suicide. Charles Forbes, head of the same bureau, was convicted for taking $250 million in bribes. Colonel Thomas W. Miller, head of the Office of Alien Property, was also convicted for taking bribes and for fraud. The Harding administration was one of the most corrupt in American history. Only Harding, Coolidge, and a few members of the cabinet remained in the clear. In 1923, Harding declared, "I have no trouble with my enemies, but my damned friends, they're the ones that keep me up at night." President Harding died in office on August the 2nd, 1923, from a stroke.
After Harding passed, Calvin Coolidge suddenly became president. Coolidge was honest, taciturn, and had integrity. His calm demeanor was exactly what America needed coming from the Harding scandals. He was very conservative, fiscally and otherwise. He vetoed the bonus bill, a program to pay World War I veterans extra, due to this fiscal conservativeness, but was overridden by Congress. He was re-elected off of the prosperity of his term, and basically achieved his goal of being the most laissez-faire U.S. president. After Coolidge, Hoover was elected. He was the ideal American president and was very optimistic. His administration was initially successful, but all too soon Black Thursday hit and the Great Depression began. Hoover passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930.
We're talking the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, and we're doing it on Hasty History. Willis Hawley and Reed Smoot were two politicians who figured that if the United States raised tariffs on imported goods, then that would give the American farmers and merchants a better shot at having competitive prices on their own American goods. These two guys introduced the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which was officially known as the Tariff Act of 1930. Now, the act passes both the House and the Senate because all of these politicians are trying to do right by the people that they represent and protect their workers. But the economists and the businessmen of the time, even people like Henry Ford, were pleading like crazy with President Herbert Hoover to veto the bill. Even President Hoover had concerns that raising tariffs and making it more expensive to import goods was going to make these other countries mad. And that was the last thing he wanted in the wake of World War I. Even so, eventually Hoover relents and he signs the bill. With the act passed and the tariffs raised, surprise, surprise, all the other countries get mad. All of a sudden, they're being told that if they want to sell their goods in the United States, they're going to have to pay an arm and a leg. Not only does this make the other countries mad to the point that they don't want to sell their goods in the United States anymore, it also makes them raise their own tariffs out of spite, so that if American importers and exporters want to sell their goods in other countries, now they have to pay an arm and a leg. At the end of the day, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff did a lot more harm than good. See, it helped the US a little bit in the short term, but in a globalized economy, something that helped the US in the short term and hurt the rest of the world in the long term meant that the rest of the world in the short term wanted to see the US hurt in the long term. Because the other countries raised their tariffs in response to the US raising its tariffs, everybody's charging an arm and a leg in taxes. And this is smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression, when nobody can afford to be messing around like this.
1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. However, this did not have such a huge effect as anticipated because women's roles stayed the same, so most women stayed at home and were not extremely involved in politics.
The 1920s have been called the Roaring Twenties, and for good reason. Not only was American culture roaring in terms of style and social trends, but the economy was roaring as well. The decade was a time of tremendous prosperity. Following the end of World War I, the industrial might of the United States was unleashed for domestic peaceful purposes. Within a few short years, an economic shift took place as the economy transitioned from wartime production to peacetime production. New technologies like the automobile, household appliances, and other mass-produced products led to a vibrant consumer culture, stimulating economic growth. Consumerism can be thought of as the culture surrounding the buying and selling of products. Consumerism came into its own throughout the 1920s as a result of mass production, new products on the market, and improved advertising techniques. With more leisure time available and money to spend, Americans were eager to own the latest items. Advertisers used this to their advantage, often stressing luxury and convenience. Through mediums like radio and print advertisements, consumer culture was more visible than ever before.
They tried the same idea on all the various parts of the car and created what were called sub-assemblies. Each man on the line became a specialist. He did one thing, and he did it perfectly, and passed the work along to the next man. Minute by minute, production was winning the battle against wasted time and wasted effort. Parts were fed to the workmen by gravity slides so they wouldn't have to stop and wait for new parts. Then they put the parts on moving conveyor belts. And this was a great step forward because now they could regulate the flow of work and keep it moving at a constant rate of speed. And the conveyor belts grew longer and more complex as they moved the work from place to place in the huge shops. They became fantastic masterpieces of planning and engineering. But the battle against wasted time and wasted effort was being won. The cars began coming off the assembly line at the rate of 1 every 40 seconds. And what Henry Ford had foreseen happened. Mass production and the assembly line drove the price of the Model T down from $850 to $300. Now everybody could have one.
Like his two predecessors, Hoover dedicated his administration to promoting business interests, while for the most part ignoring the desperate state of America's heartland. With the war's closure came the end of government price supports, and foreign need for imported grain and foodstuffs declined. Warehouses and grain elevators were filled to capacity with a lack of sales and increased productivity. Farm income went from $14.5 billion in 1919 to $8.1 billion in 1921.
So farmers in the rural sections of the United States never really emerged from the depression that they fall into right around 1919, 1920. And they stay in a depressed state. And no economy can remain viable if its agricultural sector is perennially depressed.
By the time Hoover became president, 1 farm in 4 had been sold to pay off debts or taxes. Keeping with his policy of rugged individualism, Hoover signed the Agricultural Marketing Act. This set up the Federal Farm Board, which loaned money to farmers' cooperatives so they could buy, sell, and store surplus crops. The act steadied crop prices, but did not help them rise. This agriculture crisis was an important precursor to the Great Depression. For Herbert Hoover, it was only a preview of what would ultimately lead to his infamy as the president who brought America crashing down.
The 1920s saw both lawful and unlawful protests, with contrasts between groups such as the National Security League and the Ku Klux Klan, as well as numerous examples of legal repression such as the Sacco-Vanzetti case and immigration restriction. Lawful protest was often practiced, although often defeated with unnecessary severity and legal repression. The Red Scare was the fear of communism rising in America after the Bolshevik Russian Revolution of 1917. The government responded with Palmer raids, arresting thousands of people whom they believed to be communists, or Reds. The police often disregarded human rights and due process of law. The raids had approval of A. Mitchell Palmer, Attorney General, so they were legal. However, people arrested in the raids were rarely communists and were simply falsely accused. In addition, the government arrested minorities and immigrants, accusing them of crimes they often did not commit. Italian anarchists Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested in Boston, Massachusetts, and charged with helping rob a shoe factory and killing 2 of their employees. The immigrants protested, claiming to know nothing of the crime. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court convicted Sacco and Vanzetti of the crimes, with a high probability that the judge and the jury had racial and discriminatory political beliefs. Efforts were made to save the 2 Italian immigrants. Tens of thousands protested in New York and cities abroad, while heavily armed policemen tried to repress the crowds. Despite attempts to save them, Sacco and Vanzetti were electrocuted. The case increased involvement in the fight to improve injustice in society. The 1920s were an age of legal repression due to the Red Scare and discrimination against immigrants.
These immigration restrictions were also influenced by fear of radical anarchists and pseudoscientific ideas about race. Whites were seen as scientifically superior to people of color, and as President Coolidge himself declared when he signed the 1924 immigration law, America must be kept American.
The movement to outlaw alcohol in America had deep roots in American history. However, it was not until the beginning of the 20th century that reformers in favor of the ban turned their sights on a national level legislation. Prohibition organizations, aided by the desire to keep American society stable during World War I, were successful in getting the 18th Amendment and Volstead Act passed. Both outlawed alcohol in America and laid the path for enforcement of this ban. Prohibition did not stop Americans from drinking. In fact, it came to define a decade in which older notions of reform met modernity head on.
The trial of John Scopes in Tennessee in 1925. Scopes was tried for breaking the law against teaching evolution, which he had been encouraged to do by the ACLU as a test case for freedom of speech. Scopes was prosecuted by William Jennings Bryan, whom you will remember as having recently resigned as Secretary of State and who had become a leader of the fundamentalist movement. And Scopes was defended by Clarence Darrow, that famous defense attorney who contemporary defense attorneys always point to argue that defense attorneys aren't all scum. Scopes and Darrow actually lost the trial, but the case drew national attention and ultimately led to evolution being taught in more American schools. The 1920s was in many ways a reactionary period in American history. For instance, the decade saw the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in a new and improved form, and by improved, I mean much more terrible. Spurred on by the hyper-patriotism that was fostered during World War I, the Klan denounced immigrants and Jews and Catholics as less than 100% American, and by the mid-20s, the Klan claimed more than 3 million members, and it was the largest private organization right here in my home state of Indiana.
At the Washington Naval Conference in 1921, the U.S. arranged several pacts. The Four-Power Pact arranged methods of discussing problems before resulting to war. The Five-Power Pact limited navies. Lastly, the Nine Powers Pact solidified the open door policy in China. The conference was intended to avoid future large-scale conflict. It was eventually quite unsuccessful. In 1928, it was recognized that Germany could not handle reparations of World War I, and the Dawes Plan tried to lighten the load. A year later, the Young Plan tried again. Neither attempt was successful. In 1928, another disarmament pact was signed, the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact. Involved countries promised that they would not resort to war to solve problems.
Stanford University.
The Cotton Club is fascinating because it's a venue located deep in the heart of Harlem. In the 1920s and 30s, the local African American population was actually not allowed in the doors of the Cotton Club. This was an all-white nightclub featuring the most eminent black entertainers, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Lena Horne. It was designed to appear as though we're a southern plantation. This was really capitalizing on a lot of stereotypes of black life that were still rampant in the Jim Crow era. I see the fascination with Harlem as part of a larger fascination with African and African American culture that's really imported from France in the 1910s, when artists like Picasso are claiming that African art is going to spur a regeneration of modernism. This was a song called Minnie the Moocher, recorded by Cab Calloway in 1931, and it's the song that really skyrockets him to fame and becomes his signature composition. The song both promotes this idea of Harlem and creates this insider-outsider paradigm where you have to teach yourself how to parse this music. The imaginary Harlem being projected and the real Harlem being experienced are equally important in understanding the music of this time. because the musicians are living the real Harlem and in their music sounding this imaginary Harlem. It's both a real sense of distrust and betrayal to this club and a sense of gratitude for giving them a platform from which to perform their music.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.
Lost generation writers gained prominent places in the landscape of the 20th century American civilization. They led the way in expression of the themes of spiritual alienation, self-exile, and cultural criticism. Their mark on intellectual history is distinct. These writers attempted to express their critical response in new ways, and their literary innovations challenged traditional assumptions about writing and expression. Some popular themes emerging in Faulkner, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and others of period include violence and alienation, historical discontinuity, decadence and decay, loss and despair, rejection of history, race relations, unavoidable change, and a longing for return to innocence. Langston Hughes wrote, "I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am, and they'll be ashamed. I too am America." Ernest Hemingway wrote a poem called Reperto de Assalto. Drum their boots on the camion floor, hobnailed boots on the camion floor, sergeant stiff, corporals sore, lieutenants thought of a mestre whore, warm and soft and sleepy whore, cozy, warm and lovely whore, damned cold, bitter, rotten ride, winding road upon the grappa side, ardity on benches stiff and cold, bristly faces, dirty hides, infantry marches, our ditty rides, gray, cold, bitter soul and ride, to splintered pines on the grappa side, at Ascalon, where the truckload died. Finally, William Faulkner wrote a piece entitled After 50 Years. Her house is empty, her heart is old, and filled with shades and echoes that deceive. No one can save her, for still she tries to weave, with blind bent fingers nets that cannot hold. Once all men's arms rose up to her, 'tis told, and hovered, like white birds for her caress, a crown she could have had to bind each tress of hair, and her sweet arms the witch's gold. Her mirrors know her witnesses, for there she rose in dreams from other dreams that lent her softness as she stood, crowned with soft hair, and with his bound heart and young eyes bent, and blind he feels her presence like shed scent, holding him body and life within its snare.
Every great myth has the same foundation: hero and his journey.
The hero is the personification of a culture. If you look back at medieval England, you think King Arthur. One character personifies, gives us a face for the era and the time. Babe Ruth became the face of the tremendous tectonic changes that were happening in America in the 1920s.
The Roaring Twenties in New York City. A time and place that Babe Ruth seems destined for.
When you see pictures of Ruth in a fur coat with a big stogie and just getting surrounded by women, that's kind of like someone born in the 70s. I imagine the 20s were probably like. Ruth really captured that time. This is a guy that was living large. Not a care in the world except for having a wonderful time. Just taking life in these huge gulps that everyone's giving him everything he wanted, and he just kept eating it and wanting more and more and more, whether it was food or women or drink or drink. And that is part of his character as well, that this guy that was too big for the world.
Everything about him was big. And of course, it comes along at a time in the 20s when bigness and speed are of the essence. And so he epitomized the notion of American clout. Literally, he was the personification of American clout. And I think the fact that he would do anything almost and say anything almost was, irresistible.
Well, that is a pip.
If Babe Ruth off the field would have been, well, I'm just trying to play one game at a time. Just going out there and trying to do the best I can for my team and trying to help them win. There's no way he's Babe Ruth. He's Babe Ruth not just because of what he does on the field, but what he does it off. And that is essential to the Babe Ruth mythic type figure as what he was doing as a player.
In the 1920s, Babe Ruth is the man. He is also a celebrity, and he's living life to the limit.
He was the Wunderkind, the young eternal boy, the puer aeternus, they call it in mythology. Gargantuan size, but one with an elan vital. This was an old theory that heroes have something different running through their veins. The Greeks used to call it ichor. It was a different kind of blood, a different kind of juice. Babe Ruth personified something new, bold, sometimes arrogant.
Beyond the pleasures, though, at the peak of his career, Babe Ruth is a star putting himself at unprecedented risk.
Turned out all kinds of labor-saving devices like vacuum cleaners, toasters, refrigerators, and not having to spend all day washing your clothes or turning over your own toast like some kind of commoner meant that Americans had more time for leisure. And this was provided by radios and baseball games, boxing matches, vacations, dance crazes. I mean, before Gangnam Style, there was the Lindy and the Charleston. But probably the most significant leisure product was movies, and I'm not just saying that because I'm staring into a camera. The American film industry moved out to Hollywood before World War I because land was cheap and plentiful. All that sunshine meant that you could shoot outside all year round, and it was close to everything. Desert, mountains, ocean, plastic surgeons. And by 1925, the American film industry had eclipsed all of its competitors and become the greatest in the world, especially if you count by volume and not quality.
The meat shaking on a bun. The big fat mama, meat shaking on a bun. Every time you shake, boy, that's a $4 million gone. The big fat mama, yes, the big fat mama. The big fat mama, the big fat mama.